Last week, I shared a quote from Bante describing how the kernel or the seed of metta is friendliness, ordinary friendliness. And this week, I want to talk quite briefly about why metta is so important, not just for our spiritual life, but for the world. So if we can have the, thank you, Sthiranaga. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to give a couple of examples of metta from our the text from the tradition. I'm going to talk about why we need and why the world needs metta, and then I'm going to give the first of a number of practical tips to try and help you build a sort of a life filled with metta. So whilst we can certainly say that metta begins with ordinary friendliness, it's so much more significant than that. So we'll have the first of those texts now. So this comes from the later Mahayana tradition and the Vimalakirti Nadesha, which some of you will be familiar with, when the Bodhisattva Vimalakirti is explaining to Manjushri how a Bodhisattva generates the great love towards all beings. And I just love some of the phrases in here. The love that is truly a refuge for all beings, the love that is peaceful because it's free of grasping, the Bodhisattva's love that continuously develops living beings, the Tathagata's love that understands reality, the Buddha's love that causes living beings to awaken from their sleep, the love that is effort because it takes responsibility for all living beings, the love that is without deceit because it's not artificial, the love that is happiness because it introduces living beings to the happiness of the Buddha. There's a lot more in that sutta if you want to look that up. And last week I also mentioned that rather than just being a fundamental practice, metta can take us all the way to awakening or enlightenment. So on our next extract, which comes from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is a slightly different translation from the one that Maharsharatna was extracting from last week. But the two parts that I've emboldened, I really like. So metta as like living in heaven right here and now. And then that last sentence, leaving behind craving for sense pleasures from the rounds of rebirth, you will finally be completely free. So that's suggesting to me that metta is a path to complete liberation, to enlightenment. Okay, so the importance of metta for ourselves on the next slide. So I just pulled out a few areas where I think these are quite significant. So when we can maintain a sense of awareness of the seeds of metta, we can use this to develop and expand our positive mood. So we can begin to become more creative, less defensive, and experience a clearer, more expansive state. And the more open state, the more open that state is, it can actually improve our awareness, our mindfulness, and it releases us from situations and trains of thought that stifle and waste our energy, so we can become more focused and then apply ourselves more effectively to skillful activity. And the more we do that, in turn, that increases the amount of energy that we can free up. So it creates a kind of virtuous circle. And one of the key benefits of this experience is that it helps us to build resilience. So whilst a Dharma life may be, as Vimalakirti put it, like living in heaven right here and now, no one is going to profess that it's an easy life. So experiencing the benefit of our practice, the joy of a life filled with metta, whilst that is great and is attainable for all of us, there will certainly be times when we will feel a sense of challenge, of difficulty, or even of doubt. and having a strong metta practice to be able to fall back on can be incredibly helpful. But beyond our own internal experience, metta also has a significant impact on those around us and, of course, the wider world. So our increased openness can positively alter the mental states of those that we encounter, and it can break down the barriers that we may perceive that exist between us and others. And it can challenge one of the most negative cultural conditions of our age, in my view, and that's polarization. And we've seen many examples in recent months that people's ignorance of the nature of conditioned existence, so ignorance that it is impermanent, it's insubstantial, and it's unsatisfactory. When people have topsy-turvy views about their life and those are challenged, a common conditioned tendency is to look for someone to blame or a place for us to place our quantum of negativity so that it takes root. We've seen this in relation to recently in relation to race, to class, to politics, particularly in the US, and more recently around aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So blaming the government, blaming those who don't follow the rules. And every time we do that, when we allow ourselves to take sides, we build the very barriers that sap our energy and actually reverse the direction of that virtuous circle. So the development of metta actually challenges this form of polarization. And in my view, the world really needs this now more than ever. So each week I'm going to offer some suggestions to help you to develop a metta-filled life. So this week's top tip on my next slide is creating joy in our lives. And again, I wanted to mention a few points here that I think are relevant. So I think for me, this begins with an awareness of the unconscious conditioning from our evolutionary brain. So that, by that I mean, we have a tendency to be highly attuned to potential threat or danger. So I'm not denying that that isn't useful. I'm not denying that the millions of years of evolution that have got our brain to this point aren't useful. But I would say that it isn't necessary when I hear Gavin Williamson or Donald Trump on the radio. There's no actual immediate danger to me. But if I allow that conditioned tendency to kick in, that can create quite a negative response in me. So it's good to realize that that's what's happening and not to feed into that and not to allow that to develop. Conversely, when we hear have a pleasant experience, when we experience pleasant Vedana, which Harsharatnam was talking about earlier, then in this practice, we can nurture it. We can actually begin to dwell upon that pleasant Vedana and realizing that what we dwell upon, we become. So if I spend all my time complaining about things, I'll perpetuate that negative mood. But if I dwell more in things that are pleasant, I can stay more in an open and an expansive mood and mental state. So we need to understand what we enjoy, what gives us joy, and then give ourselves permission to engage in those pursuits. And I think with guidance from the precepts, these can become refined over time and become much more creative. So I'm thinking here of things like music, of writing, of art, nature. And lastly, I wanted to say that metta has an important active quality. So a mettaful response would be one that goes out into the world. It would be an active response and goes out into the lives of others. So my last suggestion is just to experiment with simple, ordinary acts of kindness. So engage in that and see what response you get from that experience. So that is my quick whistle stop 10 minutes.